One more sunrise could decide whether Grace Whittaker lost everything her family had built for generations. Long before the town woke up, Grace was already outside pulling on her worn boots while the morning air still cut cold across the ranch. She did not need an alarm anymore. Her body knew the hour. The cows were waiting. The broken machines were waiting. The bills on the kitchen table were waiting too. Whittaker Ranch had once been the pride of the valley. Now every corner of it seemed to whisper the same warning. The old tractor had not started in weeks. The water pumps coughed and rattled like they were ready to die. The pastures once green and wide were turning dry under the Texas sun because Grace could not afford the repairs they needed. But she kept moving. She carried milk buckets before breakfast, fixed fence posts with blistered hands, and smiled whenever her sick father Henry Whittaker looked out the bedroom window and asked if things were getting better. Almost, she would say. It was not true. At night, when the house was quiet and Henry was asleep, Grace sat alone with the ranch papers spread before her. The numbers never changed in her favor. Debt after debt. Deadline after deadline. A life's work slipping through her fingers. Still Grace refused to let go. This land was not just dirt and fences. It was her mother's dream, her father's pride, and the last promise Grace had left to keep. Grace stayed at the table long after the lamp began to flicker. The ranch papers lay open in front of her, but her eyes had moved past the numbers. Past the debt, past the repair bills, past the warnings stamped in red ink. What she saw instead was her mother's hands. Evelyn Whittaker had hands made rough by work and gentle by love. Hands that could calm a nervous calf, mend a torn shirt, and hold a grieving neighbor without saying a word. Everyone in the county had known Evelyn. Not because she was rich. Not because she carried herself like someone important. But because when a small farmer had no way to sell milk, Evelyn found a buyer. When a family's truck broke down before market day, Evelyn sent help. When a widow thought she would have to sell her cows, Evelyn sat at her kitchen table until midnight and found a way to keep her going. That was what Whittaker Ranch had always been. Not just land. Not just barns and fences and cattle. It was a lifeline. Grace rose slowly and walked to the front porch. The night air was quiet, but it was not peaceful. In the distance she could hear a loose gate knocking in the wind, steady and hollow. Beyond the porch, the fields stretched into darkness. Her grandfather had worked those fields. Her father had protected them. Her mother had turned them into something bigger than one family. Grace could still remember Evelyn's voice from those final weeks, thin from sickness but firm enough to cut through any excuse. "Promise me," her mother had whispered, gripping Grace's hand from the bed. "Don't let them take this place. Not while people still need it." Grace had promised. At the time she had thought grief was the hardest thing she would ever carry. She had been wrong. Grief was heavy, but it was clean. Debt was different. Debt followed her into every room. It sat beside her at breakfast. It rode with her in the truck. It waited in the silence after every phone call from a supplier who no longer trusted her to pay on time. Still, Grace could not bring herself to see the ranch as a burden. Every fence post had a memory. Every path had a story. The old barn still held the smell of her mother's soap and fresh hay after rain. Near the cattle chute, there was a scar in the wooden rail from the year Henry had dropped his hammer and laughed so hard. Evelyn had scolded him for acting like a boy. Beside the milkroom door, Grace could still see the small mark where her mother had measured her height when she was 10 years old. To anyone else it was just property. To Grace, it was a family Bible written in soil, sweat, and sacrifice. From inside the house, Henry coughed. Grace turned at once, but the sound faded. He was still asleep. She stood there in the doorway, torn between the father who needed her and the land that needed her just as much. Then her eyes moved toward the road leading to town. Somewhere beyond those hills were the families her mother had fought for. The small dairy owners. The workers. The people who would lose more than money if the cooperative fell into the wrong hands. They would lose their voice. Their prices. Their chance to stay on the land their own families had loved. Grace pressed her hand against the porch rail. She was exhausted. She was afraid. And for one quiet second she wanted to stop fighting. But then she pictured Evelyn standing in the yard at sunrise, sleeves rolled up, chin lifted, smiling like hard work was not a curse but a calling. Grace wiped her eyes before the tears could fall. "No," she whispered into the dark. "Not yet." The ranch was wounded, but it was not dead. And as long as Grace Whittaker could stand, her mother's dream still had one person left willing to bleed for it. The next morning, Grace found her father sitting by the bedroom window before sunrise. Henry Whittaker used to be the first man awake on that ranch. He had been the kind of man who could ride fence lines all day, lift feed sacks like they weighed nothing, and come home with dust on his boots and laughter in his chest. Men in town used to say Henry knew every inch of his land by heart. Every creek bed. Every weak spot in a fence. Every cow that needed watching. Now he sat wrapped in a blanket, his shoulders thinner than Grace wanted to admit, his hands resting on the arms of the chair as if even holding them there took effort. Outside the window, the fields were still dark blue under the early sky. Grace stood in the doorway for a moment holding the small tray she had brought him. Oatmeal, toast, a glass of water. 3 pills lined up beside a folded napkin. Henry did not turn around. Pump sounded bad again this morning, he said. Grace forced a small smile even though he could not see it. It always sounds bad before coffee. Henry gave a weak breath that was almost a laugh. Then the room went quiet. She walked in and set the tray on the table beside him. His eyes stayed on the pasture beyond the glass. There was a time when he would have been out there already, boots wet from the grass, calling instructions before anyone else had even opened their eyes. Now the land was close enough to see and too far away to touch. That hurt him more than the sickness. Grace knew it. She handed him the medicine 1 pill at a time. He swallowed slowly, closing his eyes between each sip of water. She watched his face carefully, looking for pain he might try to hide. He did the same to her, searching for fear she refused to show. They were both lying with their silence. How bad is it? Henry asked. Grace picked up the spoon and stirred the oatmeal, buying herself a few seconds. We're managing. Grace. Just her name. Soft. Tired. But it stopped her cold. Henry turned from the window. His eyes were still sharp even if the rest of him had grown weak. I know what managing looks like. This isn't it. Grace looked down at the tray. The bank called again, he said. She did not answer. And the tractor still isn't fixed. Still nothing. And you've been crying at night. Her throat tightened. Henry reached for her hand, but the movement was slow and uncertain. Grace took his hand before he had to struggle. His fingers closed around hers. They felt colder than they used to. Sell it, he whispered. Grace looked up fast, almost like he had struck her. No. Listen to me. No, Daddy. His face twisted, not from anger but from the pain of saying what he never wanted to say. Your mother is gone. I'm not much help anymore. This place is eating you alive. Grace shook her head. Don't say that. It's true. It's not. Henry looked past her out toward the fields. Land can be lost slowly, sweetheart, so can people. The words broke something inside her, but she held herself together. She had learned how. She had learned how to carry buckets with blistered hands, answer phone calls she dreaded, and smile in front of a sick man who still wanted to protect his daughter. She knelt beside his chair. This ranch is not just land, she said. It's Mom. It's you. It's every family depending on that cooperative. If we sell it, doesn't just end for us. Henry's eyes filled but no tears fell. Grace squeezed his hand. I made Mom a promise. And I'm making you one now. As long as I can stand, Whitaker Ranch will not change hands. For a long time, Henry said nothing. Then he lifted his trembling hand and rested it against her cheek. You always were her daughter, he said. Grace closed her eyes, leaning into his palm like she was a little girl again. Outside, the sun began to rise over the wounded fields. Grace stayed beside Henry's chair until the sunlight reached the foot of his bed. For a while, neither of them spoke. The room was filled only with his shallow breathing and the distant sounds of the ranch waking up outside. A cow called from the barn. Somewhere near the shed, a loose chain tapped against metal in the wind. Ordinary sounds. Familiar sounds. But that morning each one felt like a reminder that everything around them was asking to be saved. Henry finally pulled his hand away from Grace's cheek and lowered it into his lap. I know what your mother asked of you, he said quietly. I know what this place meant to her. Grace looked down. But a promise should not destroy the person who made it. The words landed heavy. Grace stood slowly, as if staying on her knees any longer might make her break in front of him. She walked to the window and looked out at the fields. The pasture closest to the house had gone pale and dry in patches. The old windmill turned slowly, groaning with each rotation. Beyond it, the fences leaned in places where Henry would once have fixed them before breakfast. She saw every problem. She also saw every memory. Her mother teaching her how to bottle feed a calf that had been rejected. Her father lifting her onto her first horse. Summer evenings when the whole family sat on the porch and listened to the crickets while the fields glowed gold under the setting sun. How could anyone tell her to sell that? How much time do we have? Henry asked. Grace closed her eyes. She could have lied. She wanted to. She wanted to turn around with a bright smile and tell him the bank was being patient, the suppliers were understanding, the repairs could wait, and everything would somehow hold together. But Henry had spent his life reading land, weather, animals, and people. He could hear a lie before it finished leaving someone's mouth. Not much, she admitted. Henry looked older in that moment. Not because of the sickness, but because he understood. Then let me say this while I still can, he whispered. If selling the ranch gives you a life, then sell it. If walking away keeps you from ending up buried under debt and grief, then walk away. Your mother loved this land, Grace, but she loved you more. Grace turned from the window, her eyes shining. That's not fair. No, Henry said. None of this is fair. The truth of it filled the room. Grace crossed her arms not in anger but because she needed something to hold together. If we sell now, Octavian Cross will buy it. Henry's jaw tightened at the name. He'll take the land, Grace continued. Then he'll take the cooperative. Then every small dairy farmer who trusted Mom will be left begging him for a fair price. You know, that's what he wants. Henry looked away. Of course he knew. Grace stepped closer to him, her voice trembling but firm. This isn't just about us anymore. It hasn't been for a long time. Sweetheart. No. She shook her head. I am tired. I am scared. I don't know how we're going to fix the machines or pay the next bill. I don't know how I'm going to keep smiling when you look at me like you already know the ending. Her voice broke but she did not stop. But I do know one thing. I will not hand Mom's dream to a man who has been waiting for us to fall. Henry stared at her and for a moment Grace saw the man he used to be. Strong. Proud. Fighting tears because men like him had been taught to swallow pain before anyone could see it. Grace reached for the blanket around his shoulders and tucked it closer. You once told me the land listens, she said softly. You said it knows who works it with love and who only wants to own it. Henry's eyes lowered. Well, this land knows me, Grace said. And I'm not leaving. Outside the wind moved across the dry grass. The ranch was still in trouble. The debts were still waiting. The bank would still call. Octavian Cross would still circle like a hawk over wounded prey. But inside that quiet room one thing became certain. Grace Whittaker could be frightened. She could be exhausted. She could be pushed to the edge of everything she had. But she would not sell. By noon, Grace understood that her father's words had not weakened her decision. They had sharpened it. After leaving Henry's room, she did not go straight back to the barn. Instead, she climbed into the old pickup and drove toward town, one hand tight on the steering wheel, the other resting over the stack of cooperative papers on the passenger seat. The road was narrow, lined with dry grass and split rail fences, the kind of road she had driven since she was tall enough to see over a dashboard. Every mile carried a name. The Miller place on the left, where an elderly couple still milked 20 cows by hand because their sons had moved away and they refused to quit. The Dawson farm beyond the bend, where 3 little girls waited every afternoon for their father to come home from the dairy shed. The narrow white house near the creek, where a widow named Ruth kept 24 cows and sold just enough milk each month to pay her taxes and keep the lights on. They were not rich people. They were working people. People who rose before dawn, patched their own roofs, stretched every dollar, and believed that land was not something you owned so much as something you answered to. Grace knew all of them. So had her mother. Evelyn Whittaker had built the cooperative with a folding table, a coffee pot, and a stubborn belief that small farmers deserved a fair chance. Back then the big buyers controlled everything. They set the prices. They made the rules. They decided whose milk was worth picking up and whose was not. A farmer with 30 cows had no voice against a company with a fleet of trucks and lawyers on call. So Evelyn gathered the families. At first there had been only 5 of them sitting in the old feed office behind Whittaker Ranch, drinking coffee from mismatched mugs while rain beat against the tin roof. They were tired. They were suspicious. Most of them had been disappointed too many times to believe in another plan. But Evelyn stood in front of them and said, 1 bucket of milk can be ignored, 100 buckets can feed a county. That line became the beginning of everything. Within a year, the cooperative was helping dozens of families sell together, buy supplies together, share equipment when a tractor broke down, and survive seasons that would have buried them alone. It was not fancy. It was not perfect. But it worked. More than that, it gave people dignity. It reminded them they were not begging for a place in the market. They had earned one. Grace pulled into the gravel lot beside the small cooperative office. The building was plain white paint peeling near the windows, an American flag moving softly above the door. Nothing about it looked powerful. But Grace knew better. Inside those walls, families had cried with relief when a late payment came through. Men too proud to ask for help had quietly accepted feed vouchers. Mothers had brought babies in car seats while they signed delivery forms. Old farmers had sat in metal chairs, hats in their hands, trying to understand how they could keep going one more season. This place was not just paperwork. It was survival. Grace sat in the truck for a moment before going in. Across the road, a young boy helped his father unload empty milk cans from the back of a pickup. The boy was maybe 10, thin as a fence rail, moving with serious little hands like the work mattered because he had already been taught that it did. Grace watched him and felt something twist in her chest. If Octavian Cross took control of the cooperative, he would not see that boy. He would see numbers. He would see leverage. He would see farms too small to fight back and families too desperate to refuse whatever price he offered. He would squeeze them until they had nothing left to give. Then the cows would be sold. The barns would go quiet. The fields would turn empty. One family at a time, the town would lose the people who had kept it alive. Grace stepped out of the truck. The wind pushed against her warm and dry, carrying the smell of hay dust and distant cattle. For a second she could almost hear her mother's voice behind her. Don't let them stand alone. Grace walked into the cooperative office with her chin lifted, though her heart was pounding. The debts were still real. Her father was still sick. The ranch was still one bad week away from breaking. But now she knew something with a clarity that burned through her fear. If she lost Whitaker Ranch, she would lose her home. If she lost the cooperative, the whole valley would lose its future. And Grace Whitaker had not been raised to protect only herself. Grace stepped into the cooperative office and felt the weight of the room before anyone said a word. The old air conditioner rattled above the door, pushing out more noise than cold air. A calendar from last year still hung crooked beside the filing cabinet. On the front desk sat a coffee mug with her mother's name faded along the side, Evelyn Whitaker, founding director. Grace touched it with 2 fingers. For a moment she forgot the bank. She forgot the broken tractor, the dry pasture, her father's tired eyes, and the way Octavian Cross smiled whenever he talked about her debts. She saw her mother standing in that same office years ago, sleeves rolled up, hair pinned back, explaining milk prices to farmers who had almost given up hope. Then Grace looked down at the folder in her hands. The cooperative bylaws. She had read them before. More times than she could count. But that morning the words felt different. Sharper. Crueler. As if the paper itself had been waiting for the worst possible moment to remind her of what it could do. She sat at the long wooden table near the window and opened the folder. The clause was on page 12. Grace did not need to read it. She knew every line by heart. Still her eyes moved over the words slowly, painfully, like someone touching a scar. To officially assume full leadership of the cooperative before her 35th birthday, the appointed successor had to be married. Married. Such a small word to carry so much damage. Her mother had written that requirement years ago, not out of cruelty, not out of doubt, but out of love shaped by another time. Evelyn had believed the work was too heavy for one person to carry alone. She had believed a family would give the cooperative stability, a second pair of hands, someone to stand beside the director when storms came. Back then maybe it had sounded wise. Now it felt like a door closing in Grace's face. She was 34. In a few months she would turn 35. And she was alone. Grace pressed her palm flat against the page as if she could hold the words down and keep them from rising up to destroy everything. Her mother had trusted her with the ranch. With the cooperative. With the farmers. With the dream. But buried inside that dream was a condition Grace could no longer outrun. If she failed to meet it, leadership would pass automatically to the vice president. Octavian Cross. The name moved through her like a cold wind. Grace looked through the window toward the road. A delivery truck rolled by carrying milk cans from one of the small farms outside town. She imagined Octavian sitting in this office wearing one of his spotless shirts, smiling that polished smile while he changed prices, changed contracts, changed futures. He would not tear the cooperative apart in one day. No, Octavian was smarter than that. He would do it slowly, quietly. He would call it business. He would call it efficiency. He would tell the farmers the market had shifted, the numbers had changed, the old way could not survive. And one by one families who had trusted Evelyn Whitaker would find themselves cornered with no choice but to sell. Grace shut the folder. The sound cracked through the office like a gunshot. Her breath came unevenly. For the first time in weeks, fear did not feel like something outside her. It was inside her chest, pressing against her ribs. She had fought debt. She had fought exhaustion. She had fought grief. But how was she supposed to fight a rule written by the very woman she was trying to honor? Grace stood and walked to the wall where an old photograph hung in a simple wooden frame. Her mother stood in the center, surrounded by farmers, all of them smiling in front of the newly opened cooperative office. Evelyn's hand rested on the shoulder of a young Grace who could not have been more than 12. Grace stared at that girl in the picture. That girl believed adults always knew what they were doing. That girl believed promises were simple. That girl had no idea that one day she would be asked to save a legacy from a sentence in a legal document. Her eyes burned, but she refused to cry. Not here. Not in this room. Not under her mother's photograph. Grace lifted her chin and whispered, "You thought I wouldn't have to do this alone." The office stayed silent. Then she looked back at the folder on the table. The ranch was running out of money. Her father was running out of strength. The cooperative was running out of time. And Grace Whitaker was running out of days before her birthday turned one old clause into Octavian Cross's victory. For the first time she understood the true shape of the trap. It was not just debt. It was not just land. It was not just one powerful man waiting for her to fall. It was a clock. And every second was moving against her. Grace had barely closed the cooperative folder when she heard tires crunch over the gravel outside. She did not need to look through the window to know who it was. Some men arrived with noise. Some arrived with anger. Octavian Cross arrived with confidence, and somehow that was worse. His black pickup rolled into the lot like it already owned the place. It was polished so clean it reflected the pale afternoon sky, a cruel contrast to the dust-covered trucks the small farmers drove every day. Grace stood still, one hand resting on the back of the wooden chair. Through the window she watched Octavian step out, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in pressed jeans, expensive boots, and a white shirt so spotless it looked untouched by the same sun that burned everyone else. He closed the truck door gently, not because he was careful but because he never had to rush. Men like Octavian believed time worked for them. And right now, Grace feared he might be right. He crossed the parking lot with the slow smile of a man walking into a room where he had already won the argument. Before he even opened the office door, Grace felt the air change. It grew tighter. Colder. "Grace," he said, stepping inside. "Working through lunch again?" She did not answer. His eyes moved around the room, taking in the faded walls, the old filing cabinets, the picture of Evelyn Whitaker, and finally the folder on the table. His smile deepened. "The bylaws," he said softly. "That's heavy reading for a day like this." Grace closed the folder and slid it closer to herself. "This is cooperative business?" Octavian gave a small laugh. "Grace, I am the vice president. Cooperative business is my business." That was the problem. He said it like a fact, not a threat. But Grace heard the threat anyway. Octavian Cross owned the largest ranch in the county. Cross Creek Ranch stretched across more land than some families could drive around in an hour. He had new barns, new machines, private wells, hired men, lawyers, accountants, and friends in every office that mattered. When banks answered his calls, they did not put him on hold. When suppliers saw his name, they extended credit. When county officials came to town meetings, they shook his hand first. To most people he looked like success. Grace knew better. Octavian did not build power by lifting others up. He built it by waiting until they were tired, then offering them a rope that turned into a leash. For years he had watched the small dairy farms fight to survive. He knew which families were behind on payments. He knew who had sick parents, broken tractors, bad wells, and sons who did not want to inherit the work. He knew weakness the way a wolf knows blood on the wind. And Whitaker Ranch was the prize he wanted most. Not just because of the land. Because of where it sat. Grace's fields connected the north pastures to the county road and the old processing route. If Octavian took Whitaker Ranch, he could expand Cross Creek across the valley like a shadow. But if he also took the cooperative, he would control the prices, the routes, the buyers, and the future of every small producer from one county line to the other. Grace looked at him and saw it clearly. He did not want to compete with the farmers. He wanted them dependent on him. Octavian walked to her mother's photograph and tilted his head, studying it as if Evelyn were a piece of history instead of the heartbeat of the room. "Your mother was a remarkable woman," he said. Grace's jaw tightened. "Don't use her name." He turned slowly, still smiling. "I respected Evelyn. I still do. But respect doesn't change numbers." He stepped toward the table and tapped one finger on the closed folder. "Debts, repairs, your father's medical bills, a birthday coming fast, and a rule your mother wrote herself." Grace felt heat rise in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "You don't know everything." "I know enough." "No," she said. "You know what people tell you because they're afraid of what happens if they don't." For the first time his smile thinned. There he was, Grace thought. The real man beneath the clean shirt and polished boots. Octavian leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Pride is expensive, Grace. So is greed." His eyes hardened. Only for a second. Then the smooth mask returned. "I came to offer you a way out," he said. "Sell me the ranch. I'll handle the debts. I'll see that Henry is taken care of. You can walk away with dignity before the bank takes that choice from you." Grace stared at him. The words sounded generous. They were poison. Because Octavian did not want to save her. He wanted to be standing beside her when she finally broke, ready to call it mercy when he took everything her family had ever loved. Grace picked up the folder and held it against her chest. "You should leave?" Octavian's smile came back calm and certain. "I will," he said. "But the calendar won't." He glanced once at Evelyn's photograph, then at Grace. "Your mother built something powerful. It would be a shame for it to end because her daughter couldn't face reality." Then he walked out, leaving the door open behind him. Grace stood alone in the office, shaking with anger she could not afford to waste. Outside, Octavian's truck pulled away. Inside, the clock kept ticking. Grace did not move until the sound of Octavian's truck faded down the road. Even then, the office still felt crowded with him. His voice seemed to cling to the walls. His smile lingered in the quiet. His offer sat in the air like smoke after a fire. "Sell me the ranch. I'll handle the debts. I'll see that Henry is taken care of." To anyone else it might have sounded kind. That was what made Octavian Cross dangerous. He knew how to dress greed in Sunday clothes. He knew how to make a trap look like a rescue. Grace locked the cooperative office and walked back to her pickup, but her hands were still shaking when she reached for the door. She hated that. She hated that one conversation with him could make her feel small in a place her mother had built with courage and coffee-stained paperwork. She hated that he always knew which wound to press. Her father. The debts. The deadline. The rule. By the time Grace drove back to Whitaker Ranch, the afternoon sun had turned hard and white over the fields. Dust rose behind her truck and followed her like a warning. At the front gate, she stopped for a moment and looked across the land. This was what Octavian wanted. Not the broken tractor. Not the peeling barn paint. Not the half-empty feed shed or the fences leaning from years of storms. He wanted the routes. The water rights. The road access. The open pastures that would connect his empire from one end of the valley to the other. And more than anything, he wanted the people. Not because he cared for them, but because he understood that a desperate farmer could be controlled more easily than a proud one. If he owned the land and led the cooperative, he could set the price of milk low enough to break them, then offer to buy what they had left. He would smile while doing it. He would call it progress. He would say the old ways were over. Grace could almost hear him at the head of the cooperative table, speaking softly to men and women who had known her mother for 20 years. The market has changed. We all have to make hard choices. This is business. But Grace knew better. It was not business. It was hunger. Octavian had been circling Whitaker Ranch for months, always with the same polished concern. One week he would ask about Henry's health. The next he would mention a banker he knew who could make things easier. Then he would talk about suppliers losing patience, repairs getting expensive, and how painful it would be if the bank stepped in before Grace made a wise decision. He never shouted at first. He did not have to. His threats arrived wrapped in advice. Grace parked beside the barn and sat there with both hands on the wheel. Through the windshield she saw one of the old dairy cows standing near the fence, flicking flies from her side. Beyond her, the pasture was thinning dry in patches where the irrigation system had failed again. Everything Octavian said about the ranch was partly true. That was the cruelest part. The debts were real. The repairs were real. Henry's medicine was real. The fear in Grace's chest was real. But his mercy was not. She got out of the truck and crossed the yard toward the house. Before she reached the porch, she saw Henry watching from his bedroom window. He lifted one hand weakly. Grace lifted hers back, forcing a smile she did not feel. Octavian had promised to take care of him. The thought made her stomach turn. Men like Octavian did not take care of people. They collected them. They collected land, favors, signatures, silence, and when a person no longer served a purpose, they were set aside like a worn-out tool. Grace stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The house was quiet. Too quiet. She leaned her back against the door and let her eyes close for 1 second. Just one. Then she pushed herself upright. Octavian wanted her frightened enough to accept his help. He wanted her tired enough to mistake surrender for relief. He wanted her to believe losing the ranch to him was better than losing it to the bank. But Grace Whitaker understood something now with painful clarity. The bank might take the land. Octavian would take the soul of it. And as long as there was breath in her body, she would not let him call that salvation. That evening, Grace spread the ranch papers across the kitchen table again. She had promised herself she would not look at them before supper. She had promised herself she would give Henry one quiet meal, 1 hour where the house could pretend to be what it used to be. But promises made to the heart did not stop numbers from waiting. And the numbers were merciless. The repair bill for the irrigation pump sat on top of the stack, folded in half but still too large to ignore. Beside it was a notice from the feed supplier, polite in wording but final in meaning. No more credit. No more deliveries until payment was made. Under that lay the bank letter she had read so many times the crease had softened in her fingers. Grace picked up her pencil and began again. Income from milk sales. Minus feed. Minus medicine for Henry. Minus fuel. Minus parts for the tractor that still would not run. Minus the loan payment that was already late. She stopped when the pencil point snapped. For several seconds she stared at the broken tip as if it had betrayed her too. Then she pressed her palms against the table and lowered her head. Every time she added the figures they told the same story. Not enough. Not enough money. Not enough time. Not enough strength left in one woman's body to hold up a ranch, a sick father, a cooperative, and a promise made beside a deathbed. Outside, the last light faded over Whitaker Ranch. The barns turned dark. The fields became shadows. Somewhere in the distance a cow called once and went quiet. The sound moved through the house like a lonely question. Grace lifted her head and looked toward the small calendar hanging near the pantry door. Her birthday was circled in blue ink. She had done it months ago without thinking much of it. Back then the date had only meant turning 35. Another year. Another candle on a cake Henry would try to bake badly and pretend was edible. Maybe a phone call from an old friend? Maybe a quiet dinner on the porch. Now that circle looked like a deadline drawn around her throat. In less than a few months, if Grace was still unmarried, the cooperative would slip from her hands without Octavian having to lift a finger. The rule would do his work for him. Her mother's own words written years ago with good intentions would become the key he used to open the door and walk inside. Grace pushed back from the table and stood too quickly. The chair legs scraped against the floor. She needed air. She stepped onto the porch. The night had settled cool across the ranch, but her chest still felt tight. The moon hung above the pasture, pale and distant, shining on land that looked peaceful only because darkness was kind enough to hide the damage. In daylight, Grace could see everything wrong. Dry patches where grass should have grown thick. Fence boards warped from weather, a shed roof sagging under the memory of too many storms. Machinery parked like old soldiers that had fought their last battle. The ranch was not collapsing all at once. That would have been easier. No, it was being taken from her piece by piece, bill by bill, phone call by phone call, a broken belt here, a late payment there, a supplier losing patience, a banker using softer language for harder consequences. And Octavian, watching from the edge of it all, calm as a man waiting for fruit to fall from a tree. Grace wrapped her arms around herself. She thought of Henry by the window that morning. How small he looked beneath the blanket. How carefully he had asked her to sell, not because he wanted to give up but because loving her hurt more than losing the land. She thought of Evelyn's photograph in the cooperative office. Her mother's smile. Her mother's faith. Her mother's impossible belief that ordinary families could stand together and survive powerful men. Then she thought of the families along the road to town. The Millers. The Dawsons. Ruth by the creek. People sleeping under roofs that depended in some quiet way on Grace not failing. A wind moved across the yard, carrying dust against the porch steps. Grace closed her eyes. She had never felt so alone. And yet, standing there in the dark, she knew surrender would not bring peace. Selling to Octavian would pay bills, yes. It might even save Henry from worrying through his final years. But it would turn every memory on that land into a receipt. It would make her mother's dream something that could be bought, renamed, and used against the very people it was built to protect. Grace opened her eyes. The clock was winning. The debt was growing. The birthday was coming. And somewhere beyond the dark road, Octavian Cross was smiling because he believed time belonged to him. But Grace tightened her jaw and stepped back inside. Before morning, she would go through every paper again. She would call every buyer again. She would search for one more way, one more chance, one more impossible answer. Because Grace Whitaker had not reached the end yet. Not while the ranch still stood. Not while Henry still watched the fields. Not while her mother's promise still breathed inside her chest. Grace did not sleep much that night. She moved through the house like a ghost, checking on Henry twice, folding unpaid bills she had no way to pay, then unfolding them again as if a different answer might appear if she looked hard enough. By dawn her eyes burned, but the ranch did not care. The cows still needed feeding. The fence near the east pasture still needed mending. The broken pump still groaned like it was begging for mercy. So, Grace put on her boots and went back to work. The morning passed in pieces. A bucket lifted. A gate dragged shut. A calf pulled gently away from a loose wire. Every small task demanded her whole body, but her mind kept circling the same impossible truth. The clock was still running. By late afternoon, the heat had settled over Whitaker Ranch in a heavy blanket. Dust clung to Grace's jeans. Sweat darkened the collar of her shirt. Her hands ached from tightening old bolts on equipment that should have been replaced years ago. She stood near the barn looking toward the dry pasture when a sound pulled her attention toward the front road. Footsteps. Not hurried. Not careless. Slow, tired steps on gravel. Grace wiped her hands on a rag and turned. A man was walking toward the main gate. He carried an old backpack over one shoulder, the kind that had been patched more than once and still looked ready to give up. His clothes were clean but worn thin from use. His boots were scuffed and dusty, the soles uneven like they had carried him across too many miles with nowhere certain waiting at the end. His face was browned by the sun, his beard rough, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion. But he stopped at the gate before entering. That mattered. Grace had seen enough men walk onto land like they owned it. This one waited. He lifted one hand, polite and careful, and stood on the other side of the fence until she came closer. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said. His voice was low. Not weak, just tired. Grace kept one hand near the gate latch. "Can I help you?" He shifted the backpack on his shoulder. "Name's Caleb Morgan. I'm looking for work." Grace studied him. The ranch had drawn all kinds over the years. Seasonal hands, drifters. Men who talked big and disappeared before sunrise. Men who wanted cash up front and complained by noon. But Caleb did not come forward with excuses or a hard luck speech ready to perform. He simply stood there in the dust, waiting to be judged. "I came in from Oklahoma," he continued. Been looking for something steady. I don't need much. Food, a place to sleep if you've got one, and a chance to earn my keep. Grace almost laughed, not because it was funny but because the timing was cruel. A man asking for work at a ranch that could barely keep itself alive. She looked past him to the road, half expecting Octavian Cross to appear in the distance with that patient smile, as if even this stranger were part of the pressure closing in on her. We're not hiring, Grace said. Caleb nodded once, accepting it before the words had fully settled. I understand. Most men would have argued. Some would have begged. A few would have taken offense, as if being told no were an insult instead of an answer. Caleb did none of that. He only adjusted the strap on his shoulder and glanced toward the barns. Not with hunger for what they were worth. Not with calculation. More like a man recognizing work when he saw it. You've got a loose hinge on that side gate, he said quietly. And the south fence is leaning. Wind's going to take it, if it kicks up tonight. Grace looked at him sharply. He lowered his eyes as if he had overstepped. Sorry. Old habit. I noticed things. The air between them changed. Grace followed his gaze. He was right. The gate had been sticking for days, and the fence line behind the barn leaned more than she wanted to admit. He had seen in 1 minute what others missed while standing right beside it. Still, she had no money to offer. I can't pay you, she said. I didn't ask for pay first. Grace frowned. Then what are you asking for? Caleb looked at the ranch, then back at her. There was no charm in his expression. No attempt to win her over. Just a plain honesty that felt almost unfamiliar after months of Octavian's polished lies. I'm asking for a chance to work, he said. I've made mistakes. I've slept in places I don't want to remember. I'm not here to take anything from you. I just need somewhere to start again. The words were simple. That was why they landed so hard. Grace thought of the bills on the kitchen table. Henry sitting by the window. Evelyn's promise. The cooperative clause. Her birthday circled in blue ink. Every problem in her life had come wearing a suit, carrying documents, smiling like business was mercy. And now this stranger stood at her gate with nothing but a worn backpack and empty hands. Grace should have sent him away. She truly should have. Instead, she found herself opening the gate. Grace opened the gate, but only halfway. Caleb Morgan stepped through slowly, as if he understood that crossing onto another person's land was not a small thing. He did not look around like a buyer. He did not study the barns like he was counting their value. He simply removed his hat, wiped dust from his forehead with the back of his hand, and waited. That waiting unsettled Grace more than any speech could have. Most men she knew filled silence because they were afraid of what it might reveal. Octavian filled it with control. Bankers filled it with numbers. Neighbors filled it with pity they tried to disguise as concern. But Caleb stood there, with nothing to sell her, nothing to prove, and nothing to hide except whatever pain had sent him walking from another state with his life packed into one old bag. Grace turned toward the barn. You know, cattle? This one can hold a few more days, he said. But not through a hard wind. Grace folded her arms. I know. I figured you did. That answer caught her off guard. No correction. No judgment. No manly pride pretending he had discovered what she had missed. Just a quiet acknowledgement that she had already been carrying more than he could see. For the first time all day, Grace let herself breathe, then Henry coughed from inside the house. Caleb looked toward the sound but said nothing. My father, Grace said. He's sick. Caleb nodded, once respectful and still. Again no questions. Grace watched him. A strange thought moved through her mind, so sudden and strange that she almost pushed it away before it finished forming. He did not know. He did not know about the cooperative clause. He did not know her birthday was closing in like a locked gate. He did not know Octavian was waiting to take control the moment she failed. He did not know the town gossip, the debts, the bank letters, the way people lowered their voices when she walked into the feed store. Every man in town knew too much. That was the danger. Any one of them could agree to help her and then ask for land money control or her name tied to theirs in a way she could never escape. Any one of them could smile kindly and turn her desperation into a bargain she would regret for the rest of her life. But Caleb had arrived empty. No history with her. No stake in the ranch. No family whispering about her troubles. No reason to want Whitaker land because as far as she could tell he did not even know what it was worth. He was a stranger. And for the first time that did not feel like a risk. It felt like protection. Grace turned away before he could read her face. There's water in the pump house, she said. You can wash up there. Thank you. And food in the kitchen. Nothing fancy. I'm grateful for anything. She heard the truth in it. Not the polished gratitude of a man trying to win favor. Real hunger. Real weariness. Real humility worn down to the bone. Grace looked back toward the road. Somewhere beyond the curve Octavian Cross was probably certain she had no moves left. Maybe he was right. Maybe this was madness. Maybe exhaustion had finally pushed her past reason. But as Caleb stood in the fading light beside the broken gate with dust on his boots and no idea what storm he had walked into, Grace felt the first dangerous spark of an impossible solution. Not love. Not trust. Not yet. Just a door where an hour ago there had only been walls. And Grace Whittaker, who had spent months watching every road close in front of her, could not look away from it. Grace let Caleb wash at the pump house, then brought him a plate of leftover stew and a thick slice of cornbread. He sat at the small table outside the kitchen, eating slowly like a man trying not to look too hungry. That somehow made it harder to watch. He thanked her after every few bites, not in a showy way, not to make her feel generous, but because gratitude seemed to be all he had left to offer. Grace stood by the sink pretending to rinse a glass that was already clean. From the hallway, Henry's room was quiet. The ranch outside was fading into evening. The light came through the kitchen window in long gold strips touching the worn floorboards, the chipped cabinets, and the stack of bills Grace had pushed beneath a dish towel as if hiding them could make them less real. Caleb noticed none of it. Or maybe he noticed everything and had the decency not to say so. When he finished eating, he stood and carried the plate to the sink. "Thank you, ma'am. I'll head out before it gets too dark." Grace turned too quickly. "You don't have anywhere to go." It came out sharper than she meant. Caleb paused. His hand still rested on the plate. "I've slept worse places than roadside grass." The honesty in his voice struck her harder than pity would have. Grace looked at him, then at the covered bills, then toward the hallway where her father slept, and finally out the window at the darkening fields. Every road in her life had narrowed to one impossible point. The clause. Her birthday. Octavian. The cooperative. Her mother's promise. And this stranger. This man who knew nothing. Her heart began to pound before her mind accepted what it was about to do. "Caleb," she said quietly. He looked back at her. "I can't hire you. I understand." "No." She shook her head. "You don't?" The kitchen seemed to shrink around them. The hum of the old refrigerator grew louder. Outside, a night bird called once from the fence line. Grace wiped her palms on her jeans. She had faced bankers, broken equipment, dying pastures, and Octavian Cross with his polished threats. But this sentence forming in her throat, terrified her more than all of them. "I don't need an employee," she said. Caleb's brow tightened. Grace forced herself to hold his gaze. "I need a husband." The words fell between them and changed the air. Caleb went completely still. Not surprised, in a small way. Stunned. As if the ground beneath him had shifted without warning. His eyes searched her face, waiting for the laugh, the explanation, the sign that he had misunderstood. Grace gave him none. "I'm sorry," he said slowly. "I must have heard you wrong." "You didn't." His hand dropped from the plate. "Ma'am, I came here asking for work." "I know. And you're asking me to marry you?" "Yes." For the first time since he arrived, Caleb took a step back. Grace could not blame him. If a stranger had said those words to her at a gate, she would have done the same. Maybe worse. But she had no room left for pride. Pride did not pay loans. Pride did not stop Octavian. Pride did not change the line in her mother's bylaws. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down because her knees no longer felt steady. "I'm not in love with you," she said. "And I don't expect you to be in love with me." Caleb stared at her. "I'm not playing a game," she continued. "And I'm not trying to trap you." "That's exactly what this sounds like." The words were fair. They still hurt. Grace nodded. "Then let me explain." She reached beneath the dish towel and pulled out the cooperative folder. Her fingers trembled as she opened it to the page she knew too well. She turned it toward him. "My mother founded a dairy cooperative that keeps dozens of small farms alive. Before she died, she named me as her successor. But there's a condition in the bylaws. I have to be married before I turn 35 or the leadership passes to the vice president." Caleb's eyes moved from the paper to her face. "Octavian Cross." Grace's breath caught. "You heard his name? I saw the way your jaw changed when you looked toward the road earlier. Figured there was a man behind that kind of fear." Grace looked down. "He wants the ranch," she said. "And if he gets the cooperative, he'll control the milk prices for every small farmer in this valley. My mother built that place so families could stand together. He'll turn it into a leash." Caleb said nothing. Grace pushed the folder back toward herself. "I have only a few months. I've tried every other way. There isn't one." The room settled into a silence so deep Grace could hear Henry coughing faintly down the hall. Finally Caleb asked, "What exactly are you offering?" "A marriage on paper," she said. 6 months. Separate rooms. Clear rules. Respect on both sides. When the cooperative is secure, we go our separate ways." Caleb looked at her like she was either desperate, brave, or out of her mind. Maybe she was all three. Grace stood again, but this time her voice did not shake. "You asked me for a chance to start over," she said. "I'm asking you for a chance to keep everything from ending." Caleb did not answer. He only stood there in the fading kitchen light holding the weight of a proposal no man could have expected when he walked up to a ranch gate looking for work. Caleb did not sit down again. For a long moment he only stared at the open folder on the kitchen table as if the words inside it might change if he waited long enough. Grace could see the confusion in his face. Not anger. Not yet. Just the look of a man who had walked onto a ranch asking for bread and honest work only to be handed the kind of choice that could alter the course of two lives. I need you to understand something, Grace said. Her voice was quiet now, but it had steadied. Once the impossible truth had been spoken, there was no use trembling around it. This would not be a real marriage in the way most people mean it. Caleb looked up slowly. Grace continued before he could interrupt. I would not ask you to pretend to love me behind closed doors. I would not ask you to share my room. I would not ask you to give me anything you don't freely agree to give. The kitchen light buzzed faintly above them. Outside, the ranch had gone dark and the windows reflected their two figures back at them. Grace standing beside the table with the folder in her hands, Caleb near the sink still wearing dust from the road. It would be legal, she said. But practical. 6 months, that's all? 6 months, Caleb repeated. Yes. And after that, we separate. The words sounded colder than she expected. Final. Clean, a little cruel. Grace forced herself to keep going. You would leave with whatever we agree on before anything is signed. I can't pay much, not now, but I can give you food, a place to stay and work if you still want it. Once the cooperative is secure, I'll make sure you have enough to start over somewhere else. Caleb gave a faint, humorless breath. You make it sound like a business contract. That's because it has to be? His eyes narrowed slightly, not with suspicion alone but with hurt on behalf of something larger than himself. Marriage isn't supposed to be a tool. I know. Do you? Grace flinched because the question found a place inside her that was already bruised. She looked toward the hallway where Henry slept. Then toward the dark window where the fields waited unseen. My mother believed marriage meant help, Grace said softly. A partner. A witness. Someone beside you when the load got too heavy. She wrote that clause because she thought she was protecting me from being alone. Her hand tightened around the folder. But she never imagined a man like Octavian would be waiting on the other side of it. Caleb's expression changed at that. The sharpness in him eased, replaced by something heavier. Understanding, maybe? Or grief? Grace could not tell. She pulled out a chair but did not sit. Instead, she turned it slightly toward him like an invitation and continued. There would be rules. Clear ones. Separate rooms. No claim on my family's land. No claim on the ranch accounts. No touching unless both of us agree. No lies between us that could put the ranch or the cooperative in danger. In public we would be respectful. Nothing more than necessary. Caleb listened without moving. Grace swallowed. And if at any point you want out, we talk about it. I won't hold you here like a prisoner. That's not what worries me. What does? He looked down at his hands. They were rough, scarred in places, the hands of a man who had not been spared much. People don't usually offer something this serious unless they're out of options. Grace almost smiled, but there was no joy in it. I am out of options. The honesty settled between them. Caleb glanced at the bills half hidden beneath the dish towel, then at the hallway, then back to the folder. He was putting the pieces together. Grace saw it happen. The sick father. The failing ranch. The powerful man circling. The birthday coming. The strange proposal from a woman too exhausted to decorate desperation with pride. And you'd trust me? He asked. No, Grace said. His eyes lifted. I don't trust you, she admitted. Not yet. I don't know you. But I know you didn't come here looking for me. You didn't come here with a plan. You didn't come here because you heard the rumors and thought you could use them. She stepped closer to the table. That may be the closest thing to safety I have left. Caleb looked at her for a long time. In that silence, Grace felt the full madness of it. Two strangers in a worn kitchen, a marriage offered like a rope thrown across a river. Not love, not romance. Not even hope in the ordinary sense. Just survival. At last, Caleb pulled out the chair and sat down. He did not say yes. But he did not walk away. Grace sat across from him, opened the folder again and turned the page toward the light. For the first time that day, the ticking clock did not sound quite as loud. Morning came without mercy. Grace woke at the kitchen table with the cooperative folder still open in front of her and a stiff ache in her neck. Across from her, the chair where Caleb had sat the night before was empty. For one sharp second, she thought he had left before dawn. She would not have blamed him. A sensible man would have walked down the road and kept walking until Whitaker Ranch was nothing but a strange story behind him. Then she heard hammering outside. Grace rose and stepped onto the porch. Caleb was by the south fence, sleeves rolled up, working on the loose boards he had noticed the day before. He had found old nails in a coffee can, straightened what he could, and was using them like they were worth something. His backpack sat near the barn, still packed, still ready to go. But he was working. He had not said yes. But he had not run. That small truth warmed something in Grace that fear had nearly frozen. She watched him for a moment, then turned toward the pasture. The land looked tired in the early light. Dry grass. Broken equipment. Fence lines that leaned like old men. But it was still there. Still standing. Still waiting for her to fight. Inside, Henry coughed. Grace brought him breakfast, helped him sit up, and smiled when he asked who was working outside. A man who came looking for a job, she said. Henry studied her face. And did you give him one? Grace looked toward the window. Caleb lifted the hammer again, steady and patient. I gave him the truth, she said. Henry did not ask more. Maybe he was too tired. Maybe he already understood that desperation had finally pushed his daughter toward a choice no one would make unless every ordinary road had disappeared. By mid-morning, Grace was carrying feed toward the barn when a black pickup appeared at the front gate. Octavian Cross. Even from a distance he looked untouched by the world. Clean shirt, polished boots. One hand resting lightly on the steering wheel like he had never held anything heavier than a contract. He stepped out with that familiar smile, the one that made kindness look expensive and danger look polite. Grace set the feed bucket down. Caleb stopped working. Octavian's eyes moved to him at once. They measured the worn clothes, the patched backpack, the dust on his boots. In less than a second, Octavian decided exactly what Caleb was worth. Nothing. Grace, Octavian called, opening the gate without asking. You should be careful taking in strangers. Grace walked toward him, her shoulders squared. You should be careful walking onto land that isn't yours. His smile widened but his eyes hardened. I came because I heard the bank called again, he said softly. And because I don't enjoy watching proud people suffer when they don't have to. Caleb looked from Octavian to Grace. There it was again. The performance. The smooth voice. The pretend concern. Octavian never came with open cruelty first. He came dressed as help. He spoke of relief while reaching for ownership. He mentioned Henry's illness like a prayer, the debts like facts, and the birthday like a bell only he could hear ringing. I can still make this easy, Octavian continued. Sell now? Before the bank humiliates you, before your father has to watch everything collapse. Before that cooperative clause does what it was written to do. Grace felt the words hit their marks. Her father. The ranch. The cooperative. Her mother. Octavian knew every wound and he pressed each one with a clean finger. But behind her she heard Caleb's hammer touch the ground. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just enough to remind her she was not standing alone at that gate. Grace lifted her chin. You call it easy, because you're not the one losing anything. Octavian gave a short laugh. Grace, you already are. No, she said. I'm struggling. There's a difference. His smile faded. Grace stepped closer. My mother built this place to keep families from being swallowed by men like you. My father gave his strength to this land until his body had nothing left to give. And those farmers you keep talking about like numbers, they are people. They have names? Children. Graves in this soil. Memories in those barns. Octavian's jaw tightened. You can dress greed up as mercy, Grace said, her voice shaking now but not breaking. You can call a takeover a rescue. You can call surrender a smart decision. But I know what you want. The wind moved dust between them. Octavian glanced at Caleb again. And what is this, your new plan? Grace did not answer. Caleb did not move. For the first time Octavian looked uncertain, not afraid but irritated, like a man who had found a locked door where he expected an open one. Grace picked up the feed bucket again. You should leave, she said. Octavian stared at her for a long moment. Then the smile returned, thinner than before. The clock is still running. Grace held his gaze. Then I'd better not waste another second on you. Octavian turned and walked back to his truck. When he drove away, the ranch did not suddenly look saved. The debts did not vanish. Henry was not healed. The clause did not disappear from the cooperative papers. But Caleb looked at Grace differently now. Not with pity. With understanding. Because he had just seen the truth with his own eyes. Grace Whitaker was not fighting because she was stubborn. She was fighting because love had left her no other choice. Caleb watched Octavian's truck disappear beyond the dusty road. For a long moment he said nothing. Grace stood with the feed bucket in her hands, trying to look stronger than she felt. But Caleb had seen enough. He had seen the fear behind Octavian's smile. He had seen the way one powerful man could turn kindness into a weapon. And he had seen Grace stand her ground, not for money, not for pride, but for the people who had no one else left to fight for them. He picked up his hammer again. I can't promise I'll be the answer, Caleb said quietly. But I can promise I won't use your trouble against you. Grace turned toward him, her eyes tired but bright. That was not love. Not yet. It was something smaller but maybe stronger. Trust beginning in the middle of a storm. And sometimes that is how survival starts. Not with a perfect plan. Not with someone powerful riding in to save the day, but with two wounded people choosing to stand together when the world expects them to fall apart. The lesson is simple: never judge the size of a miracle by the appearance of the person carrying it. Help can arrive dusty, tired, and empty-handed. Strength can come from loyalty, sacrifice, and the courage to protect something bigger than yourself. If this story touched your heart, tell me in the comments, would you trust a stranger to save your family's legacy? And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story may remind you that hope often walks in when every door seems closed.